Every evening for 3 decades, Johnny Carson welcomed America into an intimate ritual. With that graceful arch of his eyebrows and that quicksilver wit, he held court from the Tonight Show desk, effortlessly conjuring laughter in living rooms coast to coast. Yet beyond the bright stage lights and perfectly timed monologues lurked a silence depth, an unspoken empathy Carson carried for Hollywood's most vulnerable figures. He wasn't merely a comedian schooled in repartee, he was a confidant who understood suffering at its rawest edge. In hushed conversations with those closest to him, he laid bare truths the studio publicity machines desperately tried to bury. Carson's code was simple yet unbreakable: never mock the shattered soul. If a star's pain had cut too deep, he wouldn't even allow humor to flicker. A former Tonight Show staff writer recalled how, during writers' meetings, certain names would drift onto the table and Johnny would quietly shake his head. Not them, he'd say. They'd suffered enough. In that gentle refusal lay a profound respect for human fragility, and a rare glimpse behind the polished veneer of Golden Age Hollywood. Of all those tragedies, none haunted Carson more than that of Judy Garland. The world first fell in love with Judy as Dorothy Gale, the ruby-slippered girl who clicked her heels and somehow made us believe in technicolor dreams. But in private recollections, Carson described a child star broken by an industry with no conscience. Signed to MGM at age 13, Garland was soon deemed too plump, too ordinary. The solution was prescription stimulants to suppress her appetite and barbiturates to force her to sleep, pills doled out by studio physicians, her own mother's acquiescence edging her toward addiction. Under a contract that treated her like a machine, Judy endured grueling schedules of 18-hour shoots, collapsing from exhaustion only to be revived with another cocktail of chemicals. By her late 20s her vibrancy had been siphoned away, replaced by a weary shell forced to smile on demand. Carson confided to a close friend, "They fed pills to a child to make her marketable. There's no defense for that." She soldiered on for years, still capable of shattering us with her voice, yet each performance was a testament to a willpower under siege. When Judy sat across from Carson in one of her final Tonight Show appearances, he saw more than the starlet who had once lit up the screen. He saw a woman drowning in plain sight, and he refused to turn that horror into a punchline. Share your thoughts in the comments. I'm curious to know what you think. Johnny often spoke of another artist whose brilliance came at an unbearable cost: Montgomery Clift. With those vulnerable eyes and a face sculpted by fate, Clift revolutionized on-screen realism in From Here to Eternity and A Place in the Sun. Yet Carson learned through mutual acquaintances that Clift's authenticity terrified Hollywood's facade-minded elite. He couldn't switch the camera off. The intensity he poured into every role mirrored unspoken battles off-screen. Battles with repressed sexuality in a time of brutal homophobia. An automobile accident in 1956 shattered more than his cheekbones. It cracked his identity. The beauty that had opened studio doors now felt like a cruel cage. Friends told Carson that Clift retreated into alcohol and pills, escaping a double life that seemed destined to implode. When he died at 45 from heart failure worsened by substance abuse, Carson saw it as the inevitable finale to a life torn between truth and concealment. Then there was Marilyn Monroe, the loneliest woman who ever lit up a room, as Carson would say. To millions she was the ultimate sex symbol, a living fantasy in white halter dresses and breathy laughs. Yet behind the platinum waves lay a woman of astonishing intelligence and sensitive ambition. Carson discovered from those who really knew her that studio bosses reveled in shaping Monroe's image as a commodity, only to abandon her the moment she dared demand respect as an actress. She fought to be taken seriously, to escape the narrow box erected around her curves and her smile, but each protest was quietly crushed. Carson refused to turn her pain into a joke. Instead, he quietly questioned the official account of her death, troubled by the thought that Hollywood had manufactured not just her image, but the narrative of her final hours. Monroe's tragedy lay not solely in her untimely passing, but in a life lived between adoration and isolation. In Carson's view, her most haunting line wasn't spoken on film. It was the silence that greeted her when she cried out for dignity. As the lights dimmed on these 3 stories, Johnny Carson carried a deeper conviction, that this pattern of creation, exploitation and abandonment was no accident, but an integral design of the Hollywood machine. Yet even as he bore witness, he held out hope that understanding these wounds might one day lead to compassion in an industry built on illusion. When the applause finally subsided and the camera wheels rolled back, Gig Young wore his Oscar like an albatross around his neck. On stage at the Academy Awards in 1970, he beamed with triumph, yet Johnny Carson knew better. Behind that grin lay a man haunted by an unspoken emptiness, a performer whose bravado masked a profound despair. Carson first heard whispers of Young's struggles from mutual friends at industry gatherings. They spoke of a man who could charm any room, who cracked jokes to erase the darkness, all while nursing a growing dependence on alcohol and pills. To Carson, Young's career arc illustrated the cruel paradox of Hollywood success. the higher you climb, the farther you can fall. Gig Young's journey began in earnest with his searing performance in They Shoot Horses, Don't They? A role that peeled back human desperation like raw flesh. He existed on the razor's edge between comedy and tragedy, and audiences drank it in. Yet for Young, the applause always rang hollow. He confided to colleagues that winning the Oscar felt less like vindication and more like a sealing of his fate. The industry would now expect greatness at every turn, offering fewer chances to stumble or heal. When roles failed to materialize after that golden night, the crack in his carefully polished facade widened. Carson learned that Young retreated into maintenance routines, therapy sessions and rehab stints, only to return to the bottle when he felt the world closing in on him once more. By the mid-1970s, the actor whose laughter once filled soundstages had become notoriously unreliable. Scenes were missed, appetite vanished, and directors stopped calling his agent. Yet no one confronted him directly, fearing to shatter the fragile star they still needed. Johnny Carson, who prided himself on piercing through Hollywood's illusions, refused to mock Young's plight. As his confidant recalled, he told us, "This is not entertainment. This is a human in crisis." The final act came in 1978, when Young shot his new bride, Kim Schmidt, then turned the gun on himself. It was a horror so jarring that Carson's entire production crew fell silent the night they learned. The man who once lit up every stage had succumbed to a private darkness no script could contain. Yet if Gig Young's death exposed the industry's failure to safeguard mental health, the story of Veronica Lake laid bare its ruthless disposability. In the fevered atmosphere of World War II, Lake's signature peekaboo hairstyle became a phenomenon, until factory workers began losing fingers in machinery because they tried to emulate it. The government demanded she cut her bangs, studios grudgingly complied. That episode foretold a deeper truth: Lake's image belonged to everyone but herself. Carson first encountered her name not in a booking request but in gossip columns, whispers that the once brilliant pin-up queen was being cast aside. With no Tonight Show appearance to anchor her comeback, she never felt welcome under those bright studio lights. Lake drifted from cocktail lounges in Hollywood to bartending jobs in New York and Miami. Industry insiders told Carson she fought fiercely against the tide, exploring roles behind the camera, seeking serious dramatic parts, searching for a foothold outside her manufactured glamour. But whispers of erratic moods and heavy drinking followed her like a shadow. The same system that had capitalized on her face abandoned her when her image dimmed. Customers in the hotel bar often recognized her but refused to believe she was the same woman. Each disbelief chipped away at her pride. Carson confided privately that Veronica's decline haunted him because it illustrated an unspoken contract: woman as commodity, woman as throwaway. When she died in 1973 at just 50, her passing barely registered beyond a late-night obituary. In the echo of her lonely end, Carson heard the unmistakable toll of an industry that knew how to build you up, and exactly when to let you fall. If Lake's story revealed Hollywood's moral bankruptcy, George Reeves's final chapter unearthed its most unsettling contradictions. As Superman on television, Reeves carried the hopes of a generation. Children believed he truly couldn't be harmed. They kicked him, pelted him with toys, convinced his heroism was invincible. Off-screen, Reeves chafed under the weight of that adoration. He yearned for dramatic roles, for the respect accorded to serious actors. But serious directors recoiled at the sight of him. They saw not an artist, but a living brand. Carson first became intrigued when rumors circulated that Reeves's fatal shooting was far more tangled than the official self-inflicted ruling allowed. Through Hollywood connections, Carson learned of a clandestine triangle involving Reeves, his wife Toni Mannix, and her powerful MGM executive husband, Eddie Mannix. Some recalled heated arguments on the yacht the night Reeves died, glasses smashed in anger, voices raised in accusation. Others spoke of Christopher Reeve's later interviews in which he described Reeves as a man terrified of secrets he could not control. Carson's closest associates said he refused to accept the closed case. He confided, "You can't write a bullet out of a story this tangled." But out of respect for Reeves's memory, and perhaps fear of powerful forces, he never aired those doubts publicly. Instead, Carson used Reeves's tragedy to underscore a systemic truth: Hollywood demanded its performers be immortal in image, even when they were profoundly human in experience. Superman might deflect bullets on screen, but in private, Reeves faced bullets he could not dodge: jealousy, betrayal, the impossible burden of living a fantasy every day. When he died in 1959, just 2 years before Carson took the Tonight Show helm, the industry moved on with barely a whisper. For Johnny, that was the cruelest twist of all: when you have nothing left to give, they simply erase your name from the marquee. These 3 stories stand as stark warnings. Gig Young's laughter turned to gunshots, Veronica Lake's beauty faded to obscurity, and Superman's bullet pierced our collective illusion of control. Each tragedy sprang from the same engine, studios that built empires on star power but refused to own the human cost. Johnny Carson carried these stories with him as silent vows, to honor the dignity those systems denied, to refuse laughter at the expense of suffering. Natalie Wood's life began under the bright glare of the studio arc lights. A child actress handed her first screen credit at age 4. By adolescence she had become Hollywood royalty, her name synonymous with cinematic grace in Rebel Without a Cause and West Side Story. Yet the closer Johnny Carson looked, the more he sensed that Wood's luminous talent concealed a relentless vulnerability, one that would culminate in a death as mysterious as it was heartbreaking. In the summer of 1981, Wood set sail on a yacht off the California coast for a weekend of relaxation with her husband, Robert Wagner, and co-star Christopher Walken. Publicly, it seemed a routine trip among friends. Privately, it became Natalie's final voyage. The official coroner's report called it an accidental drowning, but Carson, ever the skeptic, was never convinced. He had interviewed Wood on The Tonight Show more than once, admired her warmth and self-effacing humor, and knew she battled a deeply ingrained fear of dark water, a terror born from a near drowning on a film set as a young girl. When whispers of quarrels on deck surfaced, heated words exchanged over drinks, tensions running high with Wagner's possessiveness and Walken's quiet concern, Carson leaned in. He heard tales of screams muffled by crashing waves, of footsteps on the cabin stairs too confused to track, of a scream cut short. He learned that the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department had initially poured cold water on any suggestion of foul play, yet reopened the case 3 decades later, reclassifying her death as drowning and other undetermined factors. This change, Carson mused to a confidant, spoke volumes about what Hollywood preferred hidden. To Johnny, Natalie's demise epitomized the ultimate betrayal, a child star groomed to enchant the public, then abandoned in mystery when she needed believers most. He lamented that the woman who had brought so many scenes to shimmering life was herself erased by an industry that feared its own shadows. In his private reflections, Carson mourned not just the loss of an icon, but the silence imposed on her story, a silence he believed protected powerful figures rather than honored the truth. But Natalie Wood's mystery was only the final stanza in a larger elegy. Over decades, Carson gathered these stories not as gossip but as evidence of a system that identified vulnerability, exploited it for profit, then discarded the human cost when it became inconvenient. He saw patterns so consistent they demanded analysis: children doped into submission, actors forced into personas at odds with their private selves, addictions accommodated when profitable, overlooked when destructive, stars abandoned the moment they slipped from the studio's favor. In his inner circle, Carson spoke of 4 mechanisms he believed underpinned every tragedy he encountered. First was predation upon youth and fragility. Young actors like Judy Garland and Natalie Wood were prized for their innocence, only to have that very innocence weaponized against them. Second was persona enforcement. Artists like Montgomery Clift and Marilyn Monroe were compelled to wear masks that suffocated their authenticity, leaving them no refuge when the lights dimmed. Third was exploitive indulgence. Addictions, be they stimulants, sedatives, or alcohol, were supplied or at least tolerated so long as the star remained bankable, only to be denied any meaningful help when the damage became too great. And fourth was systemic abandonment. Once a star's marketability waned or their suffering threatened the bottom line, the industry severed ties with alarming cruelty. Veronica Lake tending bar in obscurity, Gig Young gunned by his own despair. These insights fueled Carson's own sense of responsibility. He recognized that as the man who sat behind that iconic desk, he had been part of the machinery, smiling beside them on television while the same studios devoured them off camera. But that awareness didn't lead to silence, it led to resolve. In his later years, he became deliberate about how he treated fragile guests, refusing to air interviews with those he felt weren't emotionally prepared for the public gaze. He once instructed a producer to shut down a segment when he sensed the pain beneath a star's forced composure. His compassion emerged not from platitudes but from lived understanding. Behind his jokes lay a man who, like so many of his guests, had battled loneliness, addiction, and failed relationships. As Carson's confidants recall, he viewed truth-telling as an act of honor. He didn't seek to shame Golden Age Hollywood or disown its achievements, he sought to contextualize them. He believed that knowing the full story, shining light on suffering alongside talent, made classic performances all the more extraordinary. Judy Garland's voice became a triumph of the human spirit when you understood the price she paid. Montgomery Clift's anguished beauty felt more potent when you saw the eyes that haunted him. Marilyn Monroe's magnetic vulnerability revealed a strength few acknowledged at the time. In the final years of his life, Carson spoke often about legacy. Not the ratings he once commanded, but the moral imperative to remember people fully, not as caricatures of glamour. As one close associate put it, he wanted posterity to know that Hollywood's fairy tale came with a very real shadow. And that acknowledging that shadow is how we grow. He hoped that future generations, armed with this history, might demand an entertainment industry that protects its own, that rejects exploitation as a cost of doing business. Johnny Carson died in 2005, leaving behind both an era of laughter and a trove of private reflections on Hollywood's hidden toll. His final act, in a sense, was to bear witness, to carry forward the stories that studios told the world to forget, so that fans might honor not only the dazzling performances but the complex humans who gave them life. Today, as we revisit these tragedies of Judy, Montgomery, Marilyn, Gig, Veronica, George, and Natalie, Carson's voice echoes in every revelation. He reminds us that behind every camera roll, every glossy premiere, lies a human being with vulnerabilities and dreams. The true scandal he revealed wasn't a tabloid scandal at all, but a moral failing, an industry capable of crafting immortal images yet blind to the mortality and dignity of those who stand before its lights. In the end, Johnny Carson's most enduring legacy may not be the laughter he delivered, but the courage he found, above all, to speak of suffering with respect. He taught us that honoring legacy means telling the full story, not just of the star's triumph, but of the human heart that beat behind the star, sometimes fragile, sometimes defiant, always deserving of remembrance in full truth.